Hello everyone, my name is Stanislav Costiuc, I'm a professional game designer with 11 years of experience in the industry, and I'm here to rank just for fun all games from one of Nintendo's flagship franchises, The Legend of Zelda. Games will be rated using my Statocritic scoring system, the details of which are explained in the pinned comment. The list will be live. Instead of ranking from worst to best, we're going year by year and see how games compare with each other on the way. The Legend of Zelda is probably one of the most iconic franchises in the gaming world, though also for the longest time it was one of the most accused for sticking to a particular formula. Regardless if you will agree with me on the final list or not, I hope to dispel that notion. There is a difference between a formula and a strong foundation that multiple games follow. Even though some Zelda games are better or worse than others, for the life of me I can't call a single one of them formulaic. But let's take everything in order and begin our ranking. From the very first seconds, The Legend of Zelda makes it absolutely clear it's about freeform exploration. You start in an empty field and can go anywhere you want. Though if you just go wherever, you'll soon find that you have no way of defeating enemies. Luckily, the cave entrance at the spawn point sooner or later would draw your attention, and inside an old man is waiting to give you a sword to defend yourself. Ultimately, that's the loop of Zelda. You explore, you discover something that makes you more powerful, so you could venture into more dangerous areas to explore some more, and so on. Even though the graphics are sort of simplistic and even weird when compared to many other NES games, the sense of freedom and the iconic music accompanying your exploration more than makes up for that. You do feel like you're a hero setting out on an adventure to save the world, carving your way through many challenges, but also getting stronger and more capable as a result. The Legend of Zelda varies its pacing by separating its playfield into an exploration-based overworld and more combat-based dungeons with a boss at the end of each one. Despite every dungeon having their own level number, you can complete them in almost any order you'd like. There's only a couple locations locked by items, including of course the final dungeon with big bad boss Ganon that you can get into without collecting all the Triforce pieces, but there's no limitations on how to tackle the rest of the game. And for the most part you don't need a guide to do so, even though the game's somewhat unfair reputation of being obtuse would make you believe otherwise. But I think this reputation is caused by many, including Nintendo itself with its digital re-releases, ignoring what at the time was a very important design element – game manuals. The Legend of Zelda's manual not only tells the story contextualizing the gameplay, which is fine enough if standard to provide sufficient motivation, but also has a bunch of hints. In fact, the game itself asks you to read the manual. This doesn't mean there's nothing at all in the game itself that would help players. In fact, there is a pretty extensive, though sometimes a bit poorly translated hint network that covers most of the things you need to know to progress, but stuff that didn't fit would be found in the manual. With all the hints that are available to you from both sources, I'd say the only problematic progression blocker is going to be the line "grumble grumble." I guess it was supposed to represent the sound the stomach makes when someone's hungry, but it's not evident at all. Otherwise though, The Legend of Zelda doesn't hide any information that would be required to complete it. Yes, there are many secrets hidden underneath trees and behind various cliff faces, but they're all optional, so no, burning and blowing up the entirety of Hyrule is not a requirement to succeed. But even so, there's tons of secret entrances across the world, and many of them are actually located in reasonable places, so if you have a hunch a tile hides something, then most likely it does. Though it always feels bad to discover a cave where you're asked to pay for repairs. with money being hard to find, particularly in early stages of the game, that can somewhat discourage you from exploration. Which matters quite a bit, as enjoyment of the game largely comes from exploring and the satisfaction of discovery, as many of its other parts are acceptable at best. For example, the core gameplay is not great at all. You can move only in 4 directions, and your basic thrust attacks have to be very precise. Getting into position in combat while avoiding enemy attacks can be excruciating, especially with enemies like Darknuts who can be damaged only from behind. Tools you find in the game help to alleviate these frustrations, but the most useful ones like bombs will often be in scarce supply. And you better save those bombs up, as half of the game's more difficult dungeons require you to test various walls for destructibility as a mandatory requirement to progress. In this regard, it does feel like you just have to do random shit to get ahead. In general, the dungeons are not particularly impressive. Outside of changing up the pace, their only interesting aspect is each having a unique shape, but I wouldn't call them examples of good game design. There's stuff like the critical for completion path holding optional treasures, while mandatory for completion items like the bow are found in optional locations. The placement of keys and locked doors often feels random. Sometimes there's more keys than doors, sometimes if you open doors in the wrong order, you'll be locked out. It feels like the game itself doesn't really care much about doors, as it provides a couple options to help circumvent any placement problems. Keys work everywhere and some merchants actively sell some, but later in one dungeon you can find a magical key that just opens all doors. The enemy configuration just gets bonkers as you progress. Level 6 is a particularly egregious example, with its rooms full of like eating your shields and 2 types of teleporting wizrobes. You will perish a lot, and the sword beam won't help much either, as not only it requires you to have full health, but also there can be only 1 active beam at a time. At least The Legend of Zelda forgoes the entire concept of lives and continues, instead having a non-password based save system, something truly innovative for the consoles of those days. I also should commend The Legend of Zelda for including a second quest with different dungeon configurations. I wouldn't say they fix any of the game's flaws, but if you enjoy The Legend of Zelda, then more content means more places to explore and secrets to discover, and that's always great. From my side though, I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 60 to The Legend of Zelda. Conceptually, I like it a lot. The aspect of exploration definitely feels satisfying, which I would guess is the main reason why the game has resonated with so many players back in the 80s. But in terms of actual gameplay, it's clunky, unwieldy, often annoying, and at times just unfair. I always say that great design is timeless, and if something feels outdated, then it's because it wasn't that good in the first place, just accept it due to lack of better alternatives. And The Legend of Zelda is outdated. It's still nice, it still has concepts and principles one could learn from, and depending on your tastes, you might enjoy it, but if you haven't played the game already, then I wouldn't recommend checking it out unless you're interested in video game history. Every long-standing franchise has a game many consider to be its black sheep. In the case of The Legend of Zelda, it's the very first sequel, The Adventure of Link. And I get it, with the perspective suddenly changing to a side-scrolling one with some abstract map navigation in between, which of course means absolutely different core mechanics, it's easy to say that Zelda 2 is nothing like its predecessor. But to be honest, even with this in mind, I find the Black Sheep moniker to be misplaced and not representative of the actual game. At the end of the day, despite different mechanics, the underlying foundation is the same as in the previous title. You set out on an adventure to explore the world, talk to people to get hints and learn how to progress, all so you could find treasures that make you more capable and resilient, allowed to venture into dungeons and deal with the ultimate evil. Sounds like The Legend of Zelda to me. That being said, I don't think Zelda 2 manages to reach the first game in terms of quality, which shows that even back in the day it was a challenge to make a sequel with absolutely different mechanics in a span of a year, especially when it's as ambitious as this game. And make no mistake, Zelda 2 is incredibly ambitious. First, it attempts to have a really huge world, which is why traveling through it is a separate mode. And to showcase the scale, the entire region from the first game is actually featured as a little section on the second game's map. Then it wanted to add much more life to the quiet barren world of the first Zelda, where most NPCs would hide alone in caves. There's multiple cities, each full of people that not only walk around, but you can talk to them and visit their houses. And finally, Zelda 2 wanted to create much more responsive core gameplay and combat systems, and for what it's worth, they are. Of course, this is on a high level. When it comes to details, there's the addition of magic, an RPG system with experience points, more elaborate enemy design, which fits with Link himself getting a larger moveset. I don't think it'll be an exaggeration to say that Zelda 2 was ahead of its time. But with innovation, there's always the risk of implementation not being up to snuff. The first game suffered a bit because of that, but it's still nice. Zelda 2, on the other hand, there's not a single aspect that's not severely flawed one way or another. The worst offender is the design of enemies, as they play a big role in moment-to-moment gameplay. The one that almost made me rage quit is the axe-throwing Daira enemy. I spent hours and hours in the Death Mountain area because of it. Their axes are unblockable, which already is breaking the existing rule of defending against projectiles with a shield that can't be upgraded in any way, but that's acceptable. The strategy against these enemies seems pretty straightforward. You jump over their axes, hit and repeat. So, a set of actions that requires skill to execute, and you can learn to do it. But sometimes, and there is no pattern or reason to that, just sometimes they throw two axes in a row. And because the second one is thrown while you're on your way down from a jump, you are most likely going to get hit with no way to do anything. Suddenly, luck matters even more than skill. And there's tons of examples with practically every enemy, ranging from them having a larger melee reach than you do, to Gorya's boomerang sometimes going beneath the ground on low throws and sometimes not. There is no consistency. And look, if difficulty is sort of a factor in the beginning, at some point you grind enough points that it stops being as prevalent. But still, if leveling up can make unfair enemy behavior less deadly, it doesn't make it any less frustrating. Especially considering that there are some enemies that delay said leveling up by taking away your XP, but not giving any when you kill them. Oh, and be careful when you complete palaces. They don't give you a set amount of points, but only the exact amount that you need to level up. So if it's 1 XP, that's what the palace will give you. If it's 9000 XP, then it's 9000. And if you don't feel like grinding for XP and want to get back to the game later, well, think again, as the game saves only what level you're at, but not how much experience points you had. But also, try not to die, as this time there's a limited life system, and if you run out of them, you will lose all your experience points and will have to start all the way back at the beginning in Zelda's chamber. Unless you're in the very final palace, and I appreciate that we have at least that checkpoint. Of course, this is not as big of a problem in modern ways to play Zelda 2, which usually involve save states, but that's more of a crutch than anything, as besides surviving and leveling, you have to understand what you actually need to do. This time, the manual is much less helpful in this regard, even when it comes to contextualizing the story. Suddenly, the Zelda you rescued in the first game is not the real Zelda, it is somebody named after her. The real Zelda slips under the spell, which you have to break, while also preventing Ganon from being resurrected. All that manages to be both simple and yet convoluted. But what's worse than the story in the manual not quite making sense is the game itself, unlike the first Zelda, being quite obtuse. Sometimes things work out great. In Rooted Town, you find a person who is named Error. Yeah, that's his name. Then later you learn that Error knows how to get to the next palace. and when you get back to Error, he tells you of a tunnel south of King's Tomb. And you know how to find that tomb because in the cemetery area there is a tile that's separate from all others, so you're drawn towards it. An old lady there says this is in fact the King's Tomb, you go south and boom, the tunnel. This is a wonderful example of the hints network working perfectly in the case where every design decision makes sense. But most of the time, they don't. You're told to not go through caves until you get a candle. Makes sense. But to get a candle, you need to go through a cave. This means the information you get is actively misleading, and sure, that cave is not a difficult one, but you wouldn't know that without going against the hint. At one point, you're asked to find a mirror. Unlike all other quest items which are found in the actual world laying on the ground, to get this one, you need to strike with your sword the space under a table in a particular house. There's no way to deduce that this is what you have to do. And I suppose what makes it a bit more annoying is that despite a far bigger world, Zelda 2 is actually more linear than the first game. Unless you count some technicalities, like leaving a dungeon after getting a key item but not completing it, or just knowing cave layouts well enough that you won't need a candle, you progress through all palaces and regions of the game respectively in linear order. There are some choices within each particular region, but if you're stuck, there's not a lot of other things you can do. I suppose this far more rigid structure is a byproduct of the RPG system, as with more freedom it will be easier to get into other territories when you're far underleveled. With all this, I haven't even mentioned a bunch of other bothersome things, small and big, like losing the selection of your spell when going to another screen, collision detection with enemies being inconsistent, and the game not only looking quite ugly, I mean, what the hell is this? And why are the interiors so mind-bending? The walls on the side are lit like their exterior walls directed away from us, but their interior walls directed at us. But also, looking at the game can literally hurt you. Most dungeons consist of a single tile sprite spread around everything. In the case of Midora Palace, each sprite has a bunch of little tiles in them, and I literally get headaches from seeing it all move. At least, the dungeon music is pretty awesome. In fact, the soundtrack of the game probably remains its only unapologetically positive redeeming point. Look, if you love Zelda 2, I can totally see why. I actually adore it on a conceptual level as well, but it's just too frustrating, with so much of its implementation being lacking one way or another, so I will give it a score of 32. I am totally on board with what it tries to do, but I'm greatly disappointed with how it does it. I usually don't include dedicated handhelds in my rankings, but considering how Nintendo has been trying to preserve Game & Watch titles in digital format, for example this very same Zelda game is available as a bonus in a Game & Watch collection for GBA, I figured they're worth an exception. What has to be understood about Game & Watch titles is that their design is literally limited by screen space, as there is no graphics per se. It's drawings that light up depending on various conditions. From that perspective, I admire Zelda Game & Watch for trying to recreate the whole dungeon loop on its two screens. You fight enemies in various chambers, get key items like maps, potions, and tomahawk? Clearly, the choice of weapons stemmed from the need to have something that could be connected to the sword images. Then you fight a dragon boss to get a Triforce piece, and repeat until you get to the end of the journey and rescue Zelda. But the game's ambition is also its downfall. Many Game & Watch titles have very simple loops, so that they could use the unassigned screen space to add some depth that would make prolonged engagement meaningful. Zelda, however, doesn't have that luxury, because it uses all its space to create the quite complex core loop, which can get stale fast, as at the end of the day most of the time you'll be just trying to hit the moblin while avoiding other enemies from hitting you. And sure, various rooms have different amounts of enemies that you need to avoid, but that doesn't feel enough. At the same time, I also wouldn't call the game bad or frustrating. It's okay enough for what it is, and maybe you will find some enjoyment in this somewhat obscure piece of Zelda history, but from my side, I will assign a score of 41. It's inoffensive, but also not that memorable. The first batch of Zelda games are probably the most obvious examples of games of their times. They're very important stepping stones, but also that's about it. I found more enjoyment in their conceptual aspects than the actual gameplay. Still, they have created some very important building blocks for the franchise, and in the next video we'll take a look at some games that took those blocks to create a strong and solid foundation to stand on.